Well, here we are, another stop on the journey to finding hope, inspiration, and positivity in this crazy world we all live in. You are listening to Changing the Perspective podcast. If you are watching this on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel and like this video below. If you are listening on a podcast service, please like our podcast on your preferred service. No matter how you choose to hear this interview, we are grateful you are following us on this journey. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Changing the Perspective. Today I have another one of those amazing people that I've met on the podcast community. I'm here just supporting each other in all the ways and hearing some cool stories. We are actually being joined from someone out of the United States, and I love when we get our international people, although she's just barely outside of the United States. So I just thank you so much for joining us today. Today, we're going to talk about overcoming kind of a negative cycle, growing up with kind of some things and living life with some negative things and being able to break the cycle and be something better. So I'm super excited to talk about this because this is something everyone kind of struggles with off and on in their life, or they know someone who has done this. So welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us kind of where this all started. Tell us your story.
Yeah, so I grew up in New York as a young girl, and I come from a abusive family. My father was, he struggled with addiction, and as loving as he could be, was even as violent as he could be, and so he did his best. That he could, but as a mother who is a victim of domestic violence, what people tend to forget is those children are also even more victims, right? Because as a child, you have no control over any of your situation. You're stuck no matter what. And there's, now I understand that there was mental illness behind the scenes and all sorts of stuff. So, my parents separated. My father was arrested multiple times for the abuse, not only to my mom, but in the community. And, he was quite a bit of a handful, I can say now. But the hardest part is, at the age of 15, during my birthday party, my 15th, the quinceañera, what they call it for Hispanics, my father did what he does, just had a little bit too much and got extremely violent. But this time it was worse than ever because he showed up with a gun and there's all sorts of things that happened. And so in self-defense, my mother shot and killed my father that night. It was, my grandparents were there. Everybody was there. Luckily, most of the people had already left because it was pretty ugly earlier during the day. My grandfather had a massive heart attack, had to be airlifted to the hospital. My grandmother had a psychotic event. I mean, it was just absolute chaos. It was like a scene of a movie. My mom was put behind the cop car in handcuffs. It was me and my siblings, my cousins, and detectives and everything, the yellow tape, the chalk around the body. I mean, it was just insane. So from there though, my mother lost it, and I could understand sometimes, but she ended up abandoning us at just months afterwards. And so I pretty much did what I could to raise my brother and sister, and my brothers and sisters. So it was difficult. I had a very a challenging life at a young age. But I say there was some part of me, and I want to, and I tell this to people because I want you to know that there's always hope. There was something in me deep down that would always say, life can't be this way. There's got to be better. I've got to be able to do more. It can't and I would even tell myself jokes like, okay, he can't be my dad. Like, there's no way. And little did I know I found out later on he wasn't my real biological father. That's a whole other story. I know, right? I haven't really talked about that, but it's just, but I would try to put this picture in my mind that there's got to be a better way. So today I look back and I say that that was faith. That was just faith in life, faith in whatever that God had planned for me, or the universe, or what everybody says. But from there, I repeated the cycles. I was homeless for a while. I got it. My mom ended up becoming an addict, a drug addict, and struggled with that. I did it for a while. And so, there was a moment in my life where it was just like, you're going down that path you said you would never. Your whole life, you would vision yourself living in this palace with these nice parents that loved you and all this, and you had things and you were happy, and here you are miserable, living on the streets, doing drugs. Like, wake up. And there's a lot of things that brought me to that moment of breakdown. But and many years of really trying to break that cycle, that mental cycle. And I now know that a lot of it is mental, but a lot of it is neurological. A lot of it is things that happened in our brain as childhood. A lot of it is embedded in our DNA, which can be changed. There is hope for that too.
Mhm.
So yeah, so just spent a lot of years trying to figure it out. That I always explain it like the 2 steps forward, three back is what it felt like, right? I would feel like I made this progress, but then I would go into these major depressions or suicidal thoughts, or go on a drinking binge. And even though I was doing all these great things, like I felt like I was always falling, or I was always like
Yes.
paddling up and just trying to get through life, to navigate through life, even up until a few years ago. So that's a little bit about my story as a child. I'm sure you have
Yes.
questions.
Yeah. So, growing up,
Mhm.
you talk about, you know, obviously children, we don't get to choose our parents,
Mhm.
um, especially as young children.
Right.
So, did you lean on someone other than your mom and dad for support, knowing the condition your parents were in?
Yes. And that's a great question, because I hope I get to talk a little bit about ACEs later on. Um, my grandparents, even though my grandmother, God bless her soul, I believe nowadays she probably would have been diagnosed with bipolar, and
Uh,
so she was really hard sometimes. Like, she was hard to be around sometimes, but
yeah.
had the heart of gold. Like, she cared so much about us. So did my grandfather. I mean, my grandfather's still around. She's not. But they were, when I look back, they were always in the shadows. They were always around. Um, they were the ones that would pick us up. They paid for all 6 of us kids to go to private school, to Catholic school.
Mm,
My grandmother worked the schoolyard so that she can afford to send us all to school.
wow.
So she was always at the school all the time. It was annoying, right? We don't want our grandmothers at school.
That's not cool.
It is so not cool, especially a Puerto Rican loud grandmother. Like, oh goodness gracious, with that deep accent.
Yes.
Was not cool. But they were the ones that, when school was going to get ready, got us our notebooks, got us our clothing. They picked us up on weekends and took us to church. And so, even though she was really rough in some ways, I now know, looking back, like I know that they always had our back. So I always knew, whatever, whenever, we could all go to them, and they were always there. They were like my parents, really.
Yeah. So, the incident, we'll just call it the incident.
Yeah.
So, how did life change for you? Obviously, dad's no longer around, and mom has now kind of committed this thing, although out of defense, and right or wrong opinions are going to be.
Mhm.
How did life change for you because of that?
You know, I struggled for a long time to even be able to admit this, but there was a short period of time that it almost felt like relief.
Yeah.
And it sounds
Yeah.
crazy, but it was almost like,
Mm,
okay, God, we don't have to deal with him anymore. Like, this
yeah.
is, we don't have to be afraid. I can sleep at night without fearing that something's going to happen. Um, But there was a part of it, as crazy it was, that he was the glue to the family.
Yes.
And so, because of him, I know my mother was forced to put dinner on the table, and she was forced because the minute he wasn't there, she was not there. And
Right.
so my life changed extremely. I went from almost mothering my mother, who would disappear for forever, but she would, I'm going to lose it. I can't take it. I need you, so I became her support. I had the kids, they were, in school. And so I had to make sure they got to school. And I started to get in trouble for being late I was a sophomore. It was the beginning of my sophomore year,
Okay.
and they started to catch on. And so uh, I ended up dropping out of school so I could take care of them. I was breaking into mini marts so that I could get bread and peanut butter to feed the kids. So, we went from at least having even the crazy foundation to none.
Yeah.
Um, but and then but then there was this other part, like I said, that it felt like some freedom too, and not that chaos. Like I felt like even I was young, I was 15, but I felt like I could give the kids some stability. I could show them love without all that fear around. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, it was insane.
That's hard.
Yeah.
So let's talk about becoming self-aware of your own actions, because that is something that I feel like as humans we struggle with.
Mhm.
Um, we struggle with admitting when we have issues, so we just stop being aware of ourselves so we don't have to admit when we know something's not right.
That's
And
so right.
I think that's horrible, but it's just what it's like we've been trained to do that.
Mhm.
So you talked about, you became self-aware that the habits you were doing were not going to get you where you needed to be. And that although you grew up in a certain way, that did not set the tone for what it had to be.
Mhm.
But talk a little bit about, that process of becoming self-aware and kind of how it felt at first to like become aware of the bad things.
Yeah. That awareness came in so many different stages.
Mm,
And so the one thing that I have to tell everyone is no matter how hard we don't want to accept this, it's almost like that onion. And
mm,
even when we do become aware and we think we're okay and we heal that, and then we get upset because we break over something else, that's
yeah,
just part of the darn onion that you got to keep peeling. And you
yeah,
have to that's just another hint that there's some healing to be done, or there's some awareness that needs to be done that's deeper than the first one. And it's kind of like once you scrape a little, you'll start to uncover more. And so the beginning awareness was more, I'll tell you, it was more about not wanting to be like them than
yeah,
anything else. That was the main thing. And so when I realized I was becoming her in where she was now and where she had been, that just it triggered me a lot. And I got pregnant at 18 and went, oh my gosh, like I always promised I would never do this to another person. I would never bring, so much harm to someone. So that's that. The kids were my aha moment getting pregnant, because I was
yeah,
like, you've got to change now. But I have to say, as hard, so when we do that, by the way, when we focus on I'm not going to be like them, we think that we are avoiding all these ways of causing trauma to our children, but instead we're just avoiding those, but then we're triggering, and so we're doing so many other things. And
yes,
that's a different set of awareness. When I found out about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and there was a study done in the 90s, and I found out about this about 3 years ago. That was my biggest awareness
mm,
part, is to understand, first of all, that trauma is generational.
yeah,
It repeats the cycle. It's the gift that keeps on giving. And we can break those cycles, but we can't do it with those band-aids. Like we've got to be able to open up. We've got to become vulnerable.
yeah,
And I think that that's a part where I just started telling my story late last year. And so I was so, embarrassed, humiliated, shameful, all these horrible emotions that
Yeah.
have this low vibration, right? And that will just keep pulling you down. And so becoming aware of that, the way we think of ourselves, the words we say to ourselves, I started to then like really pinpoint what is it that is keeping me from being that person I used to believe one day I could, or when I go into those rabbit holes, like why? What
Yeah.
stories am I telling myself? What's on
Mhm.
repeat again in this head that won't shut off?
Yeah.
So that whole awareness of these patterns and these cycles, and the awareness of knowing that we have, I mean, science tells us we will almost always repeat some of these cycles or
Yeah.
these so knowing that alone is one of the things that really helped me try to break those cycles.
Okay. Yeah. I like that. So, in the significant other abuse,
Mhm.
for me, a long-term boyfriend relationship, it's very similar. You kind of have to break your own negative talk to realize that, you deserve better than what you're going through. And so to hear that, it happens as a parent, I'm learning more and more that abuse is abuse, regardless of who it comes from.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so the difference, though, I feel like in hearing a lot from a parental abuse standpoint is as kids, that's when we should be developing our self love for ourselves.
Right.
And the parental abuse turns that off. If
Right.
you have self love for yourself, you can still be manipulated. I was still manipulated into a bad relationship, but you're, I think, less likely if you grew up in a more,
Loving and caring environment.
yes,
Uh-huh.
yeah, absolutely.
And science tells us that now with all the research out
Mhm.
there that tells us that's one of the most important things is being able to feel like you're loved, like you
Yeah,
matter, like you belong.
yeah,
And so even if you have horrific trauma, that's one of the things that will counter that trauma is as a child knowing you were loved, knowing you have that community or that
mhm,
person that cares deeply about you.
yeah. So I grew up in a pretty loving, caring world. My mom was more strict than my dad, and my sister and I knew that. What's weird though is, and this is very recent. I went 11 years in an abusive relationship and lost all self confidence and all whatever. Very mental, emotional, turned physical. I got out when it turned physical, but an incident happened in my family a couple weeks ago, and I got triggered back into that relationship. And it was a situation with my mom, and it was really the way it was handled and the way the words came out that
Mm,
I ended up triggered back to a relational thing, even though it was a parent conversation.
wow.
And, it, I went to counseling for lots of years when I got out of that. And I had to call my counselor and go, okay. So,
Mhm.
like, I'm back in this weird confusion, and my husband and I are amazing. This happened with my parents, and this isn't like typical for what I would experience because we can have hard conversations and it's fine. Whatever reason, this hard conversation did not settle well.
Mhm.
And I had to learn that there are triggers of trauma that can be triggered by any type, not just like for me, significant other, it's anyone. And
Right.
I basically had to go back and apologize like, you all you all didn't live my life. I am triggered and that's really not your fault, but you just need to know the reality of how it settled for me because
Mm.
my reaction came from that trigger.
Oh my gosh, you have a good counselor then that
Oh my god.
because there's so many and
Yes.
that's one of the things is that your counselor is trauma informed trained if to
Yes.
be able to have those type
Yeah.
of right those advice because um one of the things we don't do especially so two things hit me when you were saying that is how like you lost your self
Mhm.
love or self confidence when you grow up with childhood trauma you don't even have it
Right.
So
Right.
it's like you don't lose it, but when you start to gain it and you lose it, it doesn't feel like you've lost it. You just go right back to comfort zone. Like, until
Yes.
you really build that muscle up. So yeah, so that's one thing. But the other thing is what we need to do. I tell everyone we live in a trigger world. People are
Mhm.
triggering people all the time and
Yeah.
we don't know it. And so we need to communicate when we get triggered. We
Mhm.
need to be able to be aware of it and understand it and be able to, in a loving and kind way, tell someone so they understand, not go back and yell and scream and you caused this or, and
Right.
even if, but the more we can communicate about our feelings,
Mhm.
which growing up in childhood trauma, you normally don't express feelings because your family usually suppresses that.
Yeah.
Because if you tell anybody, somebody's going to jail or they're taking
Right.
your kids away, or so
Right.
there's all these things that you are, brainwashed to never talk about
Mhm.
because why would the abusive person be okay with you saying what he does is bad, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, and so I think that's one of the things we need to learn more is to be able to communicate how we feel,
Mhm.
and that's huge for me right now.
So when I got out of my situation, and I think this would be the same for a situation like yours, where you end up as a teenager and you're becoming aware of like, I've got to make some changes if I don't want to be in that same place. I seeked out a counselor that was specific for abuse, PTSD,
Mm-hmm.
because when I was going through getting out of that situation, Google became my best friend. Like, I'm experiencing this and I just don't even know what to call it. And I started realizing that I was in a narcissistic abuse situation. Well, I needed someone that knew that disorder because those triggers are like wild.
Mm-hmm.
And especially right when you get out. As a kid, I think you would have to try to find a counselor that PTSD has to be part of the scenario, but also can understand the teenage mind, the teenage value, because what we put on our lives when we're 16, 17, 18 is so different than when you're 35 and up and trying to live an adult life now. And so I have told multiple people out there, I seeked out something very specific.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, if you're seeking out a counselor, it needs to be someone that you have a comfort with, but you absolutely need to seek someone out that is going to challenge you and not like push you in the wrong direction, but actually challenge your mental way of thinking. Like, well, why do you feel that way? And being able to like dig into a deep place.
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes we get in those counselors that make us just feel good and they kumbaya our world, but that is not your fix.
Right.
And so I would just tell anyone seeking help, like you've got to seek out the right person and keep fire them and hire them until you find the right one.
Right. And with trauma, you also want to make sure either they are NLP
Mhm.
trained or a cognitive behavioral therapist.
Yes.
Because all, what I didn't know for years and years, and this was an aha awareness about 2 years ago. Um, it was that language thing that I didn't realize that I was still repeating in the back of my mind, even though I was
Yeah.
all good and I felt great and overcome so many challenges,
Yeah.
but there were still those talks. So I remember I was working on a project with the psychologist on trauma in the Philippines, and I got triggered by something. And then all I remember is him correcting so many of the words I was saying during that trigger. And I was like, I was getting so mad because I was like, but listen to what you're saying. Like you're going back to that right now.
Right.
It's not always, it's not this. And how do you change that change the story, find the hook to the positive or change the experience. Like yes, it happened, but if you keep going to it the way it happened, it's still going to keep you there. But if you change the way you feel about what happened, and focus on what it's brought to you today, and the impact you're making on people's lives, and it changes the way you feel about that experience. And I thought that was so, that was
Yeah.
key.
That's awesome. I also feel like in this world, because we are triggered, it's okay to not continue reliving your past. And I have people in my life that like to remind me where you came from. You survived that, or they remind it from a negative standpoint. Oh, you really had to deal with some stuff and you made
Yeah.
some bad choices during all of that. Well, okay,
We
I've
don't
gone
want
yeah.
that.
I've gone to counseling to fix myself, to get over what I've experienced, and I don't need to continue reliving it because it's just going to set other things in motion that are unnecessary.
Right.
And so I've been really one thing I've been self-focusing on is when I hear someone's story, I let them tell what they want, but I am never going to push them to relive something they're not willing to be back a part of, because I'm going to push them in a direction that's going to set something else in motion in their head that isn't fair for them. It's not okay.
Like,
And so,
you have to be ready.
yeah,
Like I said, last year I had been talking about being able to talk about my story for
yeah,
years.
yeah.
And but I felt I didn't understand feelings, by the way. That's
Okay.
another thing. If you, especially in as a child,
Yeah.
if you are in an have had been in any type of abusive home, sorry, I can't even talk. There's many people. I can't give you the statistics right now, but I looked it up. Their sense of emotions and feelings are distorted
Yeah.
because you're used to feeling certain things and being, triggered for this or recognized for this, or maybe you're being praised because you're getting mom the ice pack because her face is so swollen and stuff. So the emotions are so different. So that was one of the things, like being able to learn. And I didn't know, like, I think when I look back, I had like a handful of emotions I could say I really understood.
Yeah.
Anger, sad, these things. And then when I really started diving into emotions last year, and there's a book by the name of it's called Permission to Feel, and it's by Mark Brackett. I learned of him from, I'm going to give you another resource, Brene Brown, who, these are both scientists who are now very famous public speakers and educators. Brene Brown opened my eyes to vulnerability. And she speaks on that. She has a Netflix documentary, and she talks about how vulnerability, we need to make it something good, and how it
Mhm.
really is damaging because of how, like, to be able, vulnerability and also shame. She's a shame expert.
Hmm.
So when I realized, when she started talking about shame, I'm like, that's how I feel. I didn't know that's how I felt. Like, I had
Mhm.
no idea I had been living my life with that feeling of shame.
Yeah.
And so then, I got my hands, she talked about Mark Brackett on something, and then I looked him up. And in the front of his book, the hardcover book, is a graph, and I mean, is a chart, and it's got different feelings, and he's
Hmm.
got different zones, and he teaches it all over the world. He's a Yale professor. He's absolutely amazing, but he's got these emotions. And so he teaches in the book that when you get triggered of anything, see what emotion resonates most with you by looking at it. And when I started doing that, I was like, oh my gosh, I would have never thought it was devastation, or I don't know, like whatever they were. I would
Yeah.
have never done that. But then he takes it another step, is once you do that, recognize that, but go deeper. What's it really triggering? What's the emotion that this is coming from?
Yeah.
And so you find out abandonment, or,
Mhm.
feeling abandoned or something like that. So it's this work on, like, knowing emotions is so important.
Yeah.
And those are my two, like, oh, like, I love them too.
We will put that in the description of this interview so people can find those
Awesome.
people. I think that's awesome. So tell us where you are now.
Wow. Well, right now I am still working on myself, right? Building. I think, I'm pretty much gone with the shame stuff. Like, there's nothing. And if I could tell everyone who's struggling with that, you know what? You're one out of eight or one out of nine people have lived through traumatic events.
Yeah.
There's no shame in that game when the statistics are that high. Over 50% of people have had some type of trauma in their life.
Mhm.
And so we sit here in silence, not talking about it. And so I've let go of that shame game, because the other part of it is, it's not your fault I think there's a, for some reason, we carry on this guilt that it's our fault, that there's something we should have done different, that maybe
Yeah.
because we were a bad kid this happened, or maybe because, and it's not your fault at all. And when you can get rid of that, that took a whole layer of pressure off of me. It took, I've dealt with chronic pain my whole life. It's lowered my levels of inflammation and pain to just release that heaviness, that it's a burden. It's like a freaking bag of, coins this big that I've been carrying my whole life. um, but right now, I really, another thing that really helped me is contributing, being in environments where I can help support people, where I can teach and explain people, give that awareness out. So I have a nonprofit that we do just that. It's weempoweraces.org. And so I spend a good part of my time trying to think of, how to build more awareness. And with that is my own healing stuff. The more I do the work, the
Yeah.
more I heal. The more we work with other people who are going through things, we can see through a different lens. We could take
Yeah.
it out of us and then have empathy for someone else going through it, which so starts to open up that empathy for ourselves, which
Yeah.
is something we also lack.
Yeah.
But I have I've had a business for 15 years, but I also realized that that darn trauma was working its way in my business too. The
Mm.
way I managed people, the way I
Yeah.
communicated, that fight or flight that would come up on a problem, and how maybe you'd shut down. And so, right now in my business, I'm just, despite of COVID, I'm on an up right now. We are, yeah, but it all because of me, because I'm changing, because I'm doing the work. I'm doing breathing exercises. I'm
Yeah.
meditating more. I'm, back into exercising more. And so doing all these things that will increase that positive energy through our body and mind. And so, yeah, so that's where I'm at. I know
Love it.
I've got still some work to do on some of the confidence and the worthiness, but definitely at a whole other place in my life. And forgiveness. That's another thing.
Oh,
So my mom and I just
yeah.
started talking really it's been about a year maybe. And when I could forgive, the funny thing is we say we forgive and we don't, but like, we really do. But honestly, when I could forgive myself for not just whatever in the past, but for holding on to this for so long, for, all that other stuff that we start to just jab at ourselves all the time.
Yeah.
When I could be at peace with that, and when I could see through that ACEs lens that I talk about, that trauma informed lens, and I could empathize that my mother must have gone through so much worse too. Like
Mhm.
she things happened to her when she was a child, because there's no way, if she was in a certain environment that taught her these things, she wouldn't be repeating this stuff. So
Yeah.
it changed the way I felt about the situation, and I had no idea that it actually was changing the way energetically we would be in the same room and she would feel it. So she's actually supporting my nonprofit now and wants to get involved in speaking about violence and domestic violence and all of that kind of stuff. So it's kind
I
of cool.
love
Like
it.
I never thought, I thought I was going to die, like not being able to have my family united after that incident.
Which is wonderful.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
it is. It really is.
I think if everybody thinks that they are done growing, then they're doing it wrong. And so working on yourself all the time is what we should be doing. We should be being, there's always a way to become a better human in some way.
Yes. And I
So,
think that's what it has to be. Like you have to make a goal to be better every time. And before you get to what you consider better, already start look beyond what's better than that and
yeah.
what's better than that. Like it's always
Yeah.
having something to reach. And I think one of the things too, if I may, on the childhood trauma side, a lot of time the visioning part of life gets distorted too. So it's hard to vision things when you're in that fight or
Mm.
flight mode. And so practicing visioning how life should be, how I want to feel, how I want to feel when I walk into a room and talk about my story, or
Yeah.
that helped me be able to be okay with doing this stuff. And I think
Yeah.
think we have to practice that more for those of you who have gone through some traumatic stuff. And I don't want anybody to think that because maybe what happened to me didn't happen to you, that your trauma isn't as important. And that's absolutely not correct.
Right.
Everybody has a different threshold. Everybody experiences things, but for God's sake, trauma is trauma. It doesn't matter if I witnessed my father get killed or if I just had some abuse. It doesn't matter. It's trauma.
Yeah.
It all scores the same in the end.
I agree 100%. I told you before I did the 20 questions interview. And I mean, I found between the ages of 20, our participants were between the ages of 20 and 54. And they all had different amounts of time that they were in their traumatic situation. They had different types of traumatic situations. And they've all been out a different amount of time as well. But the commonality between everyone across the board, regardless of their type or how long or how it got started, it was all the same. It was all
Mhm.
the same. And so it trauma is trauma. Abuse is abuse. It's all the same. All the same.
And mental abuse is almost worse than physical abuse.
Mhm.
So a lot of
Yeah.
people, in our society for years, and I'm so happy that we're starting to look at mental health and we're starting to really, it's not a nasty word anymore. So there's so
Yeah.
much more hope for the youth now who's going through things. It's more out there, but science has showed us now that emotional abuse can be even more devastating on someone
Yeah.
than the actual, taking the beating.
Right. I think, being more aware of mental health, it just really is the reality of the world. It's not ignored as often now. The
Right.
reality is the whole amount of hundreds and thousands of years that people have been around, mental illness has been a thing.
Mhm.
Now, whether you hid it, you just didn't admit it, a family member put them in a closet and never let them out, whatever. I mean, I'm
Mhm.
just throwing out randoms.
Yeah,
It's
for
always
sure.
been there. The bonus is the generation that's come up behind us is seeing the world different than we all saw it. So it's no longer the same faux pas. It's no longer this like thing to ignore. They're now showing the reality of the real world. And so I think that's a great movement that's happening, this mental health type awareness thing. I think it's
Mhm.
awesome.
Right.
Um,
It
so
really is. It really is.
yeah. So, what advice do you have for someone that's struggling in maybe they've been out of a childhood situation and they still haven't gotten over it, or they're, teenagers that are maybe still in it? What advice do you have for these people?
For one, to remember you're not alone. You are not alone. And so, find a community. There's so many resources now available to us, but don't hold it. Don't stay in that shame game. Don't stay in that. And no offense to anybody, in that self pity mode, because that was me for a lot of time. We
Yeah.
have the ability to make a choice in how we want to see things and how we want to move ahead. And we get stuck in that, in not making that choice
Mm.
because it feels, we're used to this and it feels good, or we're still stuck in that self-pity thing. So, really, you first of all, find a community, and you can find me. We have a Facebook group, and my organization. We're here to support, but there's lots of support out there. Just don't do it alone, because you don't need to. Take a look. One of the things I would say to everybody who I know who's struggling with how to deal with trauma, I send them to, on my website. I have a video of a TED Talk from Dr. Nadine Burke, and she talks about how trauma affects your DNA, how it affects your neurological system, your response systems. So become aware. Awareness is the key. You
Mhm.
cannot fix what you don't know. You
Yeah.
don't know what you don't know, but once you know, you can find the tools you need. And have some faith and have some hope, and put yourself out there, because and anything could be possible, and try to find meaning in what happened. How can you use what's happened to you to impact the world or impact people, or how can you, and that's what I did. I started nonprofits over 20 years ago, and that was my way of probably staying sane, to be honest. I don't know what I would have done. And so I was able to find meaning in my traumas because I could relate, I could understand, I could empathize. And all of a sudden I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so grateful this happened to me because I know how to help somebody. And so those little things like that, giving back and getting involved in organizations, and contributing, donating to something, that a good cause. I just believe that is such a huge part that people don't do, that they should.
Yeah. And to piggyback your advice, if you're currently in the situation, trust your gut. Really pay attention to those things that maybe you don't know what they are, but Google is a thing now. And back when you were experiencing it, it was not. But it is now. And so you have ways to research those feelings and emotions you're having to justify that they are real feelings, they're real emotions. And don't ignore your true emotions. Don't just bypass them.
And we were all put on this earth the same. We were all born to be wonderful. We were all born to, with love, and with and so just remember, like, you matter. Just
Yeah.
try to love yourself no matter what. And if you don't, I love you. I mean, somebody out there is going to love you, and just love it. I've realized I was so blocked in love for so long. Like, after I got in an abusive marriage as well. And so I decided I had to, like, nope, love's not for me. I don't know how to do this. I'm never going to do it again. And so, I've been single for 20 something years, just, and what I realized was my heart, as much as it loved, there wasn't enough love for me to be able to break free. And so just start loving on yourself. There's nothing wrong with that. I met this 89-year-old lady who said her dad taught her when she was younger. Mind you, she didn't have any aces, like wonderful, childhood. So I love to learn by these people because they obviously have different habits that I learned. And she said her dad taught her when she was very young to, every morning when she wakes up, to look in the mirror and tell yourself, I love you. I love you. You are beautiful. You are amazing. And to do that, as she says, I'm 89 years old. I wake up, my hair's everywhere. I got these bags on, wrinkles everywhere, and I love me. So you can get
Awesome.
into that pattern and that habit, and it'll become natural.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this interview. Great discussion, some wonderful information. For our listeners out there, if you want to go across just south of San Diego into Mexico, I have someone that would probably want to join you for a little drink and a conversation. She's invited me already to Mexico. So
Come on out. I have a nonprofit out here. We have a crisis center. We have a
Perfect.
thrift store. We have a shelter. Come see me.
Perfect. For all of my people watching on YouTube, I ask that you subscribe to the channel that you're on, as well as like this video. Send us a comment. I'll make sure that we show all of those comments, that we can respond to all of them, whether it's me or whether is it Sherist? Sherist?
Sorry, Sherist.
Sherist. And we would love to comment on anything that you have to say. If you're listening on a podcast, make sure to favorite our podcast so that you be notified weekly of our new stuff coming out. We've got some really cool things in the pipeline right now. I'm just so excited about what we have coming up this summer. So please join us by subscribing to your things. I hope everyone had a great week. Have a wonderful weekend, and we will catch you next time. Bye.